Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 1. The Groan of Stressed Metal. The sound was an ending, not a clang or bang, but a deep, terminal groan of 1,000 tons of pressure-forged steel meeting its final home. A grinding shriek that vibrated through the recycled aggregate of the plaza floor, up through the soles of Jorin's worn boots, and into the marrow of his bones. It was the sound of a closing tomb. For a single, drawn-out second, the noise was everything. A physical presence that drowned out the market chatter, the hiss of pneumatic vendors, and the ever-present, life-sustaining hum of Amphitrite itself. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse, far worse. With the final seating of the bulkhead, the world went black. Not the familiar ink black of the abyss outside of Viewport, but a suffocating, close-in darkness that swallowed all light and dimension. The familiar orange sodium vapor lamps of the sump plaza died in a single synchronized blink. The holographic advertisements for nutrient paste and jewel chit loans dissolved into nothing. For 3 full heartbeats, the only thing that existed was the ringing in Jorin's ears and the sudden, terrifying clarity of the voices in his head. "It's dark now, isn't it? Just like before." The voice was a woman's, thin and reedy, a memory fragment he'd picked up from some drowned technician. Then his daughter's voice, sharp as fractured glass. "Daddy, I can't see." He squeezed his eyes shut, a useless gesture in the absolute void. The silence was a violation. 78 years Amphitrite had groaned. It was the city's lullaby, its great, living song of survival against the crushing weight of the ocean. The deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, the rhythmic pulse of the water reclamation pumps, the whine of the ventilation in the whispering gills, it was the sound of being alive. Its absence was the sound of a corpse. A line of sterile blue emergency lights sparked to life along the base of the walls. The light was cold, clinical, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like deep-sea leviathans. It revealed the scene in stark, terrifying detail. Frozen faces turned upwards, eyes wide, mouths agape, a sea of stunned disbelief. Jorin saw a mother instinctively pulling her child close, a Tide Lord tough guy dropping a canister of illicit glimmer moss, his swagger gone. He saw vendors standing motionless behind their inert food paste dispensers. And everywhere, he saw the same dawning horror reflected in hundreds of pairs of eyes as they all looked in the same direction, toward the bulkhead. It was a sheer, unbroken wall of rust-streaked, dark gray metal where the main causeway to the mid-levels had been. Rivet heads the size of a man's fist studded its surface, each one a final, unarguable statement. It sealed the plaza from floor to ceiling, a perfect, brutalist monolith. It wasn't a door anymore. It was a gravestone. The shock began to thaw, replaced by the heat of panic. What was that?" A woman near Jorin stammered, her voice trembling. An old man, a retired pipe fitter with skin like cured leather, reached out a shaking hand and touched the public water fountain. He twisted the handle. Nothing. Not even the wheeze of trapped air. "No water," he rasped, the words dropping like stones into the quiet. The pumps are off." That was the spark. The realization cascaded through the crowd. No pumps meant no water. No turbines meant no heat, no primary light. The dead ventilation system meant the air they were breathing was all the air they had. They were cut off, completely. "The Spireborn did this!" someone screamed from the far side of the plaza. "They've sealed us in!" Praxilla. Jorin breathed the name, the sound lost in the rising noise. Compliance, the Hull Integrity Act. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a sentence. The crowd broke. A low murmur erupted into a roar of fear and rage. The spell of disbelief shattered, and the plaza became a churning vortex of bodies. The first wave of people surged toward the bulkhead, a futile human tide crashing against immovable steel. Fists hammered against the metal, the sound of frantic, pathetic drumming against the impossible mass. "Let us out! Let us out!"
"Rustrot, open the door!" The blue emergency lights cast the scene in a macabre strobing effect as the power reserves wavered. Jorin was shoved sideways, his shoulder slamming into a support pillar. The press of bodies was immense, a panicked beast with 1,000 limbs. He saw a cart of hydroponic fungi overturned, the pale, ghostly growths crushed underfoot. A child's cry was swallowed by an adult's scream. "This is how it happens," a cold voice in his head observed. Not one of the echo's ghosts, but his own numb detachment. Not with a hull breach, but with a lock and a key. He pushed off the pillar, fighting to stay upright. Panic was a contagion worse than any microorganism. It stripped away a lifetime of training, of discipline, of the core ideology that the hull is the whole. Here, now, there was no whole. There were only parts, terrified and trapped and turning on each other. He saw Grendel Brecker near the edge of the chaos, not panicking, but observing. The Tidal Lord's broad frame was rigid, his eyes narrowed, scanning the bulkhead, the emergency lights, the crowd. He wasn't seeing a disaster. He was seeing a power vacuum. He was measuring the cage. Jorin pushed away, deeper into the lee of a shuttered kiosk. He needed a moment, just a second for the world to stop tilting. He leaned his back against the cold metal, the distant thudding of fists on the bulkhead a new desperate heartbeat for the sump. The air was already starting to taste stale. The smell of fierce sweat mingled with the omnipresent damp. He closed his eyes, and the silence he had craved for years returned, but only inside his own skull. The external chaos faded to a dull roar. In that inner quiet, the whispers were waiting. They were clearer now, no longer faint echoes, but distinct voices rising from the depths of his captured memories. "The pressure is dropping. The seals won't hold." That was the welder from the Triton 7 disaster. "I can't breathe. Oh gods, I can't breathe." And Liana, always Liana. Her memory wasn't replaying the breach anymore. It was something new, something twisted by the echo's influence. Her voice was calm, almost curious. "They can't all drown, Daddy. Not like me. There isn't enough water." Jorin's breath hitched. A cold dread, colder than the abyss, settled in his gut. He was trapped in a box with 1,000 screaming people. But they were only trapped by the bulkhead. He was trapped in a cage of dying minds, and the walls were closing in, made of his own corrupted memory. The screams outside were a comfort compared to the silence within. A silence that was getting very, very crowded. The only sound in the compliance command center was the ghost of a hum, the barest whisper of high-frequency current cycling through the polished obsidian floor. It was the sound of perfect, frictionless function, a sound Praxilavar cultivated as carefully as the Spireborn cultivated their synthetic orchids. The air was cold, scoured of the city's endemic damp and smelling sharply of ozone from the data servers that lined the curved, brushed steel walls. It was the scent of absolute control. Dominating the space, a three-dimensional holographic map of Amphitrite floated in the gloom, a delicate latticework of cold blue light. It rotated slowly, a miniature god's-eye view of their world. At its base, in the district known as the Sump, a festering wound of data pulsed. A chaotic, angry swarm of thermal signatures, thousands of tiny pinpricks of heat-red light, churned and scattered like panicked microbes in a petri dish. They bounced off a new, stark white line that had not been there an hour ago. The quarantine seal. A perfect, unbreachable perimeter. Praxila stood before it, her reflection a pale specter on its surface. She wasn't watching the crimson chaos. Her eyes were fixed on the clean white line of the bulkhead doors. She tracked the telemetry streaming beside it, atmospheric pressure, structural integrity, energy bleed. The numbers were flawless, green, stable, beautiful. "Chief," the voice was a discordant note in her symphony of order. Sub-Director Kalen shifted his weight beside her, the subtle scuff of his regulation boots an offense against the silence. She could smell the faint sour tang of sweat on him, a biological failure she found personally insulting. "The life sign readings from the Sump," he began, his gaze fixed on the frantic red swarm. "They're frantic. Biomonitors are showing citywide panic-level adrenaline and cortisol spikes."
Praxila did not turn. "Frantic is a symptom, Sub-Director, a predictable variable in a larger equation." Kalen swallowed audibly. "But the sheer number, the projections from sustenance estimated maybe a few hundred infected, not all of them. We've sealed tens of thousands." "Containment is not a scalpel for precision work, Kalen," she said, her voice as flat and cool as the polished walls. "It is an axe. You cannot halt gangrene by trimming a fingernail. You sever the limb, cleanly, decisively." As if on cue, a soft chime announced an incoming priority channel. The insignia of the Triarch Council shimmered into existence beside the map. Praxila gestured with 2 fingers, accepting the call. A disembodied voice, belonging to Liaison Oris from the Engineering Division, crackled with static-laced anxiety. "Chief Var, report. The spire is vibrating. The resonance from the bulkhead closures. Is it stable? Have you achieved containment?" Praxila's eyes finally flickered from the bulkhead data to the churning red mass. For a moment, she allowed herself to see it not as data, but as a biological reality, a cancerous growth, an infection that threatened the sterile perfection of the whole. "The whole is the whole, Liaison," she replied, her tone a chillingly calm statement of fact, "and the Sump is no longer part of the whole. The infective limb has been amputated. Pressure in section GAMM9 is stable and holding at 100%. The quarantine is absolute." "And the inhabitants?" Oris asked, the word catching in his throat. Praxila's focus returned to the numbers. "The inhabitants are now an external variable, irrelevant to the structural integrity of Amphitrite. Compliance command out." She swiped a hand, and the Council's insignia vanished. Silence returned, heavier this time. Kalen hadn't moved. She could feel his unease radiating off him like heat, another messy, biological impurity. "Chief," he started again, his voice now barely a whisper. They've cut the water reclamation, the power grids. There are children down there, Praxila."
Using her first name was a boundary crossed, a failure of protocol. She turned slowly, her entire body rigid. Her eyes, the color of a sunless sea, finally met his. He flinched, as if from a physical blow. Her internal state was one of profound clarity. She didn't feel cruelty or anger. She felt disappointment. Disappointment that he, a sub-director of compliance, could be so compromised by sentiment. Sentiment was the first crack in the hull, the first drop of corrosive water. It was the enemy more than any microorganism.
When he was gone, she turned back to the silent, floating god in the center of her room. The red swarm in the sump was already beginning to thin, the thermal signatures flickering out one by one by one. She felt a sliver of clinical satisfaction, the same a technician feels when a corrupted file is successfully deleted. She placed a hand flat against the cool, smooth surface of the command console, her fingers tracing the telemetry from the quarantine door. The numbers held steady, perfect, unyielding. Outside the mirrored dome of the spire, the abyssal dark pressed in, full of monsters and crushing weight. But in here, in her clean, cold room, all was silent. All was in order. The air in Grendel's hub was thick enough to chew. It was a cocktail of familiar sump stenches, the sharp ozone of overloaded circuits, and the damp metallic bite of rust, but layered with the Tide Lord's signature aromas, the earthy musk of cultivated glimmer moss, the clean, almost shocking scent of mineral-rich water from a hidden tank, and the acrid tang of plasma cutter exhaust. Kale, all of 19 and feeling every second of it, kept his back pressed to a stack of salvaged pre-inundation data drives. Their plastic shells were cold and brittle against his thin jumpsuit. He, like the 50 other souls crammed into the fortified cargo bay, was breathing shallowly, as if trying not to use up his share of the air. The usual thrum of Amphitrite was gone, the deep, life-affirming groan of the turbines, the rhythmic drip of condensation. All of it had been swallowed by an oppressive, terrifying silence when the quarantine bulkheads had slammed shut. Now the only sounds were the ones they made themselves. The rustle of worn fabric, the occasional stifled sob, and the low, anxious murmur that was the sound of 100 unspoken fears coalescing into a single cloud of dread. A heavy-duty work lamp, jury-rigged to a battery pack, cast a sickly orange glow over the proceedings, painting faces and harsh strokes of light and shadow. Then Grendel Brecker moved, and the murmuring died. He stepped onto a platform of stacked coolant barrels, a hulking silhouette against the flickering light. His face, a road map of scars and hard living, was unreadable for a moment. He wasn't a Spire-born with their clean lines and synthesized confidence. Grendel was carved from the sump itself, from pressure-stressed metal and grim necessity.
He let the silence stretch, forcing them all to feel its weight, to feel the cold seeping from the bulkheads, to remember the shuddering finality of the lockdown. "They call it a quarantine," Grendel began, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence without needing to be loud. It was a voice accustomed to being heard over the shriek of failing machinery. "A health measure, for our own good." He took a step forward, his heavy mag boots clanging on the metal barrels. "Look around you. They cut the power, they cut the water, they cut the air scrubbers. You can already feel the chill, can't you? That's not the feeling of being protected. That's the feeling of a tomb being sealed.
A woman near the front let out a choked gasp. Cale saw her hands fly to her mouth. Grendel's eyes, chips of obsidian in the gloom, found hers. His expression didn't soften. "Fear is what they want," he continued, his voice hardening. "They want us down here, huddled in the dark, turning on each other for a crust of nutrient paste or a mouthful of recycled water. They want us to rot, to become just another story the Spireborn tell their children about the drownings in the sump. Praxilavar signs the order, and 50,000 souls are condemned. She calls it compliance. I call it an execution." The word hung in the ozonic air. Execution. It was a spark hitting dry tinder. The crowd's collective fear, a moment ago a formless, suffocating blanket, began to coalesce. Cale felt his own terror sharpen, twisting from a passive dread into something hot and angry. The man next to him, a grizzled pipefitter whose face was a mask of despair, slowly clenched his fists. "They think we're diseased," Grendel said, a bitter, humorless laughing sound escaping his throat. "And maybe we are. The whispering gills have been singing for years. We all know someone whose echo touched, someone who hears things, sees things." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, daring anyone to deny it. No one did. The spire sees a sickness to be excised. I see a gift. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial register. They are hunting a man. You've heard the compliance patrols. A welder, one of us. They call him Patient Zero, the Source, the Plague Bringer.
Cale knew who he meant. Jorin, the quiet, haunted man who worked the taps, the man who'd saved a whole sublevel when that theater pipe blew, just by knowing, somehow, exactly where to strike. "They say the echo has him." Grendel's voice rose again, shedding the whisper and taking on a preacher's fervor. "They say it's rewriting his mind. They're right, but they don't understand what that means. When a pipe is about to burst, who knows it first? The engineer with his schematics, or the metal itself? When a bulkhead groans, who feels the stress? The computer in the spire, or the bolts holding it together?" He slammed a fist into his open palm, the sound like a pistol shot in the confined space. A few people flinched. "This man doesn't just hear the dead, he hears the city. He feels its bones grinding together. The echo isn't just a plague, it's a key. It's a map to every single structural weakness, every hidden conduit, every maintenance tunnel that Var and her trigger-happy goons don't even know exists." The desperation in the room had found a name, Jorin, and the fear had found a target, Praxilavar. "They locked us in," Grendel roared, his voice now a raw force of nature that filled every corner of the bay. "They built the cage, but they gave us the key to unlock it. This isn't a quarantine, this is a war for every breath of air, for every drop of water. It's us against them, the Hall Clingers against the Spireborn who left us to die." He pointed a thick finger out at the crowd, at Cale, at the pipefitter and the crying woman. "So you can stay here and wait for the air to turn sour and the lights to die for good. You can wait for the cold to take you, or you can fight. We find the welder, we find Jorin,
We stop seeing him as a disease and start using him as the weapon he is. We use his knowledge to navigate the city's guts, to bypass their lockdown. We will break through their checkpoints. We will take back our resources, and we will climb all the way to the spire atrium and crack that pretty glass dome of theirs so Praxilla Var can finally see what the abyss really looks like."
For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a single voice from the back shouted, "Deep and safe!" It was the common greeting, but now it sounded like a battle cry. Another voice joined, then a dozen, then the entire room erupted. The floor vibrated with the stamping of boots. The air, once heavy with despair, now crackled with vengeful energy. "Deep and safe! Deep and safe!" Grendel Brecker stood above them, a faint predatory smile gracing his lips. He drank in their rage, his eyes glittering with cold ambition. He hadn't offered them hope. He had taken their desperation, honed it to a razor's edge, and given them an enemy. KL, caught in the maelstrom, was shouting with the rest of them, his throat raw, his fear burned away by a fire Grendel had ignited. He was no longer a frightened boy huddling in the dark. He was a soldier. They all were. Soldiers in the Tidal Lord's new army. The air in the old cistern was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of melted tallow, unwashed fear, and the damp metallic tang of the walls themselves. It was a circular chamber, a decommissioned filtration hub, its curved bulkheads weeping trails of black condensate that shimmered in the light of 100 mismatched candles. Here, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the lost and the terrified of the sump had gathered. Jorin stood near the back, his frame swallowed by the shadows between two massive silent pipes. He watched the faces in the flickering gloom, gaunt, hollow-eyed hole-clingers, their knuckles white as they clutched ration packs or the hands of their children. And among them, the others, the echo touched. A woman staring at the curved wall, her lips moving without sound, tracing patterns in the rust with a trembling finger. A young man, barely 20, rocking on his heels, his gaze fixed on a point 1,000 yards beyond the metal hull of the city. Their stillness was more unnerving than any panic. It was the stillness of a radio tuned to a dead channel, broadcasting only static from a drowned star. Inside Jorin's own skull, the static was never dead. It was a chorus of whispers, a library of last breaths. The pressure, gods, the pressure, a voice he didn't know. Then, cutting through it, sharp as fractured permaglass, Liana's voice, a memory so worn it felt like a scar. "Daddy, I can't hold on." He flinched, the motion lost in the anonymity of the crowd. The shuffling and murmuring ceased as a man stepped onto a rusted pump housing in the center of the room. This had to be Hestian. He was nothing like Jorin expected, not a hulking Tide Lord like Grendel or a manic prophet. He was thin, wiry, his sump coveralls patched but clean. He had the same pallor as everyone else, but his eyes, deep set and clear, held a profound and unsettling calm. He didn't speak. He simply waited, his hands loose at his sides, letting the silence he commanded push back against the ever-present groan of Amphitrite that pulsed through the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it filled the cistern, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in concert with the city itself. "You are afraid," he began. No accusation, just a statement of fact. "You feel the tremors in the bones of this city. You hear the shrieks of stressed metal in your sleep,
and you see the change in the eyes of your friends, your family. A new quiet, a deep quiet. He swept his gaze over the assembly, meeting the eyes of the echo-touched with a look of recognition, of welcome. They call it a sickness, a plague from the taps. Grendel Brecker tells you to sharpen your shivs, to hoard your jewel chits. He tells you to fight, to spill blood to save your own. He's right, a voice barked from the crowd, a burly man with a Tide Lord sigil tattooed on his neck. We should be taking the conduits to the spire, not hiding in a sewer listening to riddles. What are we doing here? A ripple of agitated agreement passed through the crowd. Fear was a simple engine. It ran best on anger. Hestian didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile on his lips. Fighting is the language of the spire-born, Hestian said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. It is the old way, to see a change and call it an enemy, to feel a pressure and try to seal it out. Look where it has gotten us, clinging to a dying machine at the bottom of the world, terrified of the very water that gives us life, terrified of silence.
Jorin's jaw tightened. Silence? This man knew nothing of silence. The silence Jorin craved was an absence, a blessed emptiness. What was happening to him, to these people, was the opposite. It was a horrifying, suffocating fullness. As if to prove the point, a new voice bled through in his mind, a woman's, laced with the gurgling intake of water. "Can't find the surface. So dark, my boy." He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a wave of nausea. This wasn't a sermon, it was a lie, a beautiful, poisonous lie. "They call it the choral echo," Hestian continued, his hands now spreading wide as if to embrace the entire chamber. "But it is not an echo. An echo is a dead thing, a sound bouncing off a wall. This is a voice, many voices. It is the story of the deep, the story of everything that has been lost to the pressure. It does not want to kill you. It wants to archive you." Archive you. The clinical, detached term sent a chill down Jorin's spine colder than any abyssal current. He wasn't a man, just a data drive to be filled. "Do not fight the current," Hestian urged, his voice taking on a new hypnotic cadence. "Let it in. Listen. You have spent your lives straining to hear over the groan of the turbines, the shriek of the hull, the shift bells and the ration queues. You have forgotten how. The echo, it is teaching you to listen again. It is offering you a new silence." He pointed to the woman who had been tracing patterns on the wall. Her hand was still now. Her eyes, though distant, were no longer panicked. They were watching, listening. "It is not the silence of the void," Hestian preached, his voice rising with passion. "It is the silence of the whole, the silence of every part of the hull knowing its purpose. No more isolation, no more fear of the breach, because we will be the breach and the seal. We will be the foundation. When a tremor comes, we will all feel it as one. We will all shift as one. We will all hold together."
He was offering them godhood of a sort, the god of the groaning machine. To become the city they feared was dying, to trade the terror of a single screaming death for a vast, collective, unfeeling existence.
Jorin looked around. The burly Tide Lord was quiet now, his brow furrowed in confusion and a sliver of hope. The mother, clutching her child, was crying, but her tears were silent, her shoulders no longer shaking with terror. Hestian had given them a new gospel, a way to reinterpret their damnation as a kind of grace. A fragile, brittle calm settled over the cistern. The candles guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The only sounds were the slow drip of water and the distant, muffled heartbeat of Amphitrite. Jorin felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was a castaway on an island of belief. These people were finding solace in the very thing that was erasing him. He could still feel the phantom cold of the abyssal water from the stranger's memory on his skin. He could still hear his daughter calling for him from a past that felt more and more like someone else's dream. Hestian's path was acceptance. Grendel's was violence. Both, Jorin realized with a sickening certainty, were just different ways to die. One was to be torn apart, the other to dissolve. He turned and slipped back into the shadows of the maintenance corridor, leaving the fragile calm of the sanctuary behind. The whispers in his head followed, a cold tide that no sermon could ever hope to hold back. The alcove wasn't a room, it was a scar, a forgotten maintenance void behind a decommissioned water reclamation unit in the deepest gut of the sump. Jorin had found it years ago. It was his only claim to stillness in a city that never stopped groaning. Here the deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines was a dull ache in his bones, not a roar in his ears. The air, thick with the sharp tang of ozone and the wet metal smell of rust, was his own to breathe. A single bare sodium vapor lamp cast a sickly orange pall over the space, painting the weeping, mold-slicked walls in shades of decay. He sat on an overturned crate, his back pressed against a lattice of cold pipes. In his hands, he turned over a small, smooth piece of sea-smoothed polymer salvaged from the wreck that had claimed his daughter. It was white, featureless. He'd held it in his pocket for 6 years, a worry stone against the tides of his own mind. Liana's voice was already there, a faint echo behind the constant drip, drip, drip of condensation into a puddle near his feet. "Daddy, the water's pretty." The memory was a frayed wire, sparking with the same pain every time he touched it. He closed his eyes, trying to sharpen the image of her face, her smile, the gap where she had lost a tooth. But it was like trying to hold smoke. The whispers were different now, since the dive, since the crack in his helmet and the shimmering ghostly cloud that had poured into him. The choral echo. His daughter's voice was no longer a solo performance. It was being lost in a chorus, faint, brushing against the edge of his hearing. "Pressure lock on Gamma 7. Can't feel my legs. So cold, so dark." "Shut up," Jorin rasped, the words swallowed by the oppressive damp. He squeezed the polymer shard until his knuckles were white. "Just be quiet." His plea was an invitation. The chorus swelled, not in volume, but in presence. The drip of water by his feet suddenly sounded heavier, slower. The hum of the turbines warped, its frequency sliding down into a gut-churning moan. The orange light from the lamp flickered, and for a split second the shadows it cast seemed to writhe, coalescing. He gasped. The smell of ozone and rust vanished, replaced by the crisp, sterile scent of new-welded Durasteel and the faint, dusty smell of schematics printed on plasti paper. He wasn't in his alcove anymore. He was standing, but his legs weren't his. They were clad in the clean, stiff work trousers of a Spire-born functionary circa 2068. His hands, not his hands, unfurled a large blueprint across a console.
The schematic was for the sump, Sector C to be precise, the very section he was hiding in, but it was all pristine lines and projected load-bearing calculations, a city not yet drowned in time and decay. My design, a thought echoed, but the voice wasn't his. It was proud, arrogant. The thought belonged to a man named Kalen, an architect. The hull is the whole, and I am its architect. The pride soured into panic in a microsecond. A klaxon blared, not the familiar shriek of Amphitrite, but a shriller, more primitive alarm. Shouts echoed from outside the pristine module. Containment failure, section C9. The support jacks are buckling. Repeat, the jack... The world tilted violently. Jorin Kalen was thrown against the console. The blueprint slid to the floor. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the deck plates, a sound of creation coming undone. He stumbled towards the viewport. Outside there was no abyssal black, but a chaotic construction site lit by harsh work lamps. Massive hydraulic presses, the size of hab blocks, were lowering a superstructure into place, and one of them was failing. Metal screamed, a sound of impossible physics. Kalen's breath hitched in his chest, Jorin's chest, and he felt a terror that was utterly alien yet intimately his own. It wasn't the open water fear of a welder. It was the intellectual horror of a creator watching his masterpiece turn into a tomb. He saw it then, through Kalen's eyes, a single support pylon, pylon 7 Gamma, at the junction with service tunnel 4B. A miscalculation. A tiny, insignificant variable in the shear stress projections he'd personally signed off on. An acceptable risk. It wasn't acceptable. The thought was a shard of ice in his mind. The ceiling above him gave way, not with a crash, but with a slow, grinding surrender. A massive durasteel beam, thick as a man's torso, sagged, then buckled, then fell. It didn't crush him instantly. It pinned him. The force drove the air from his lungs in a wet, final sigh. The pain was absolute, a white-hot nova that erased thought. His legs were gone. His lower body was just pressure. And then came the water. It wasn't a flood. It was a leak, a steady rising tide of cold, briny water pouring from a ruptured conduit somewhere above. It pooled on the floor, creeping up his chest. He tried to scream, but his diaphragm was crushed. Only a choked, gurgling hiss escaped his lips. The water was black, reflecting the single sparking emergency light. It touched his chin. He smelled the salt, the minerals. It felt like the abyss itself was seeping in to claim him. Through Kalen's dying eyes, he saw the blueprint floating on the surface of the rising water, the ink blurring. The diagram for pylon 7 Gamma was facing up, a final accusation. The water covered his mouth, his nose. I'm drowning, the architect thought, his mind a crystalline spike of pure terror. Inside my own perfect machine, I am drowning.
The sensation broke. Jorin was back on the crate, convulsing. He scrambled backwards, his head cracking against the cold pipes behind him. He was soaking wet, but it was his own sweat, cold and slick. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as if he'd truly been deprived of oxygen. The taste of salt was on his tongue. The alcove was as it was. The orange light, the dripping water, the familiar hum. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes, trying to force the architect out. "Liana," he whispered, a desperate prayer. He tried to picture his daughter, her face, her eyes. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, he couldn't. The image was corrupted, overlaid with the memory of a dying man's fear, the sight of a floating blueprint. His personal grief, the last thing that was truly his, had been invaded, colonized. Rust rot, he choked out. The horror wasn't just the death he'd experienced, it was the theft. Then, a new sensation settled over him, cold and precise. The architect's knowledge. The ghost in his head had left a gift. He turned his head slowly, looking at the solid bulkhead to his left. He didn't see a wall. He saw through it. He saw the cramped, unlit space of Service Tunnel 4B. He saw Pylon 7 Gamma. He could feel its precise coordinates, could sense the immense, unimaginable pressure it was under. And he could see the flaw, not with his eyes, but with an intuitive, horrifying certainty. A hairline fracture, invisible to any scanner, propagating from a single misaligned rivet head from a century ago. A shear point, just as Kaelen had realized in his last moments. A single, catastrophic point of failure, waiting for the next tremor tide. He was a welder. He knew metal. But this was different. This wasn't knowledge. It was revelation. The choral echo hadn't just shown him a ghost, it had shown him a map. The alcove stank of ancient damp and ozone. It was a space that wasn't meant to exist, a forgotten pocket between a recycler junction and the outer hull wall, accessible only by a loose ventilation grate. Here, in the gut of the sump, the groaning of Amphitrite was a physical presence, a deep frequency thrum that vibrated through Jorin's bones. He sat with his back pressed to the weeping metal, knees drawn to his chest, trying to breathe through the chorus in his head.
It was worse now. So much worse. Liana's voice, the memory he had clutched like a shard of glass for years, was now just one thread in a fraying rope. A dozen, 100 other voices wove through it. The pressure, gods, the pressure. A man's terrified gasp. It's so dark, I can't see the light. A woman's sob. They weren't ghosts. They were archives. Fragments of final moments stored in the shimmering parasite that now swam in his blood and nested in his mind. He closed his eyes, but that only opened the floodgates to their memories. He saw a flash of a rusted control panel, fingers fumbling with a switch. Not his fingers. The nails were bitten, the knuckles scarred in a pattern he didn't recognize. He wanted silence. That's all he had ever wanted. The silence he imagined existed in the spire. The silence he had lost the day the first breach took Liana. Now, even the relative quiet of this forgotten hole was a lie, filled with the echoes of the drowned. A scrape of metal on metal cut through the din. "Hiding in the whispering gills, Jorin?" Grendel's voice was a low rasp, calm and devoid of surprise. "Not very original, but I suppose desperate times." He let the sentence hang in the air, thick as the briny smell of rust. Jorin didn't move, didn't speak. The name of the ventilation maze sent a fresh shiver through him, the place where people claimed they first heard the dead. Grendel knew. Of course he knew. "I've been hearing whispers of my own," Grendel continued, taking another step closer. One of his thugs coughed, a low, guttural sound of impatience. "Rumors about the Level 3 conduit breach. How a welder, out of his mind with grief and pressure sickness, just knew which joint was going to blow. Saved a few hundred sumprats from a steam bath." Grendel tilted his head. "That was some trick, Jorin. Some knack." "It was luck," Jorin croaked, his voice raw from disuse. "I know pipes, that's all." The denial felt pathetic even to him. The knowing hadn't been an educated guess. It had been a certainty, a map of stress fractures blooming in his mind's eye, screaming at him in a silent language of physics and decay. It was the echo, showing him the city's bones. Ha ha, luck. Grendel tasted the word as if it were a cheap synth protein he was considering spitting out. No, I don't think so. Praxilla Var doesn't hunt men for being lucky. She hunts them for being different, for being contagious. The name landed like a physical blow. Praxilla, the iron-willed chief of compliance, the reason the sump was now a cage, sealed by massive bulkheads, the reason he was hiding in this stinking hole. I don't know what you're talking about, Jorin insisted, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. I'm not contagious. I just want to be left alone. The time for being left alone is over, Grendel said, his voice losing its mock-casual tone and hardening into something sharp and cold. The sump is sealed. The air scrubbers are on emergency cycle. The water reclamation is failing. In 3 days there will be riots over the last of the nutrient paste. In a week we'll be drinking our own piss and fighting over scraps of fungi. Praxilla has cut us off to die. He crouched, winning his face level with Jorin. The man smelled of glimmer moss and something else, something clean and alien, like pre-inundation soap, a smell of power. I have no intention of dying down here, Grendel whispered, his eyes glinting. And neither do you. You are my way out. That knack of yours, that trick, you're not just hearing ghosts, are you, Welder? You're listening to the whole rust-rotted city. Jorin recoiled. The directness of it, the horrifying accuracy, made him feel flayed open. He was a freak, a walking disease, and this ghoul of the black market saw him as a tool, a key. No, he said, shaking his head. The chorus flared, a wave of denial. Don't let him in. Don't let him use us. I can't. It's not something I can control. Then learn to control it, Grendel snapped, his patience finally breaking. One of his thugs took a heavy step forward, the hum of his stun maul escalating slightly. I need you to listen. I need you to find me a way through the quarantine. A forgotten conduit, a maintenance shaft that's not on the schematics, a weakness in the bulkhead at gate Delta 7. I don't care what it is, you are going to find it for me. I won't, Jorin said, the words tasting like ash. Every time listen, I lose something. It takes something. He thought of the man's hands on the control panel, of the woman's fear of the dark. They were becoming his memories. Liana's face was getting harder to see clearly. And what do you think VAR's compliance officers will do when they find you? Grendel stood up, brushing dust from his priceless jacket. They won't just seal you in a box, Jorin. They'll cut you open. They'll peel back your skull to see what's making you tick. They want to know what the disease is so they can kill it. I just want to use the symptom. He gave a slight nod to his men. So here is the offer, Grendel said, his voice flat and absolute. You work for me, you get my protection. You eat, you drink clean water. My Tide Lords will keep the compliance hounds at bay. You help me, and we both survive. You refuse, and I leave you here. Or perhaps I make an anonymous tip to the local compliance post. I hear Praxilla pays a handsome bounty in jeweled chits for her patient zero."
The threat hung in the air, heavier than the weight of the ocean above. The two thugs watched him, their faces impassive. There was no escape. The path to survival was through the very madness he was trying to flee. To willingly dive into the cacophony, to let it guide him, was to accelerate his own dissolution. But the alternative, starvation or the cold clinical curiosity of Praxilla dissectors. He felt a memory surface unbidden. A little girl, not Liana, her face pale, water streaming from her lips. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. The voice in his head was a child's whisper. "Don't let them leave us in the dark." Jorin's shoulder slumped. The fight went out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. He gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. Grendel's smile returned, a sliver of white in the gloom. It was a smile of pure, predatory victory. "Good," he said. He gestured for his men to pull Jorin to his feet. They hauled him up, his legs unsteady. "I knew you'd be reasonable. Deep and safe, welder." As they guided him out of the alcove and into the neon-scarred darkness of the sump's underbelly, Grendel clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt less like camaraderie and more like ownership. "Now," the Title Lord said, his voice resonating with a terrifying new purpose, "let's see what the Whispers have to say about Gate Delta 7. The air in the alcove was thick enough to swallow, heavy with the sharp tang of ozone and the damp, metallic breath of rust. Grendel Brecker leaned close, his bulk sucking the remaining space out of the repurposed storage locker Jorin now called a sanctuary. A salvaged data pad, tethered to a sparking power conduit, cast a sickly orange glow across the Title Lord's scarred face. "It's simple, Jorin." Grendel's voice was a low growl, like stones grinding together. "Compliance has a checkpoint at the Vent Stack 7 junction. They're running bioscans on everyone trying to get to the mid-levels for the next ration cycle. They're hunting you. But the ducts behind that checkpoint, they're old, pre-inundation spec. The pressure schematics are a lie."
Jorin flinched, pressing his head back against the cold, sweating metal of the alcove wall. Grendel's words were a physical force, but the real assault was inside his own skull. A woman's panicked gasp for air, a child's cry, the dull thud of a body hitting a bulkhead. The choral echo was a rising tide. Not my memory, not mine. The thought was a raft in a storm. "The city groans, Jorin, but you hear it speak," Grendel continued, tapping a grimy finger on the schematic. "You know the weak points. You feel them. We create a diversion, a small pressure overload in a secondary pipe. While they scramble, we slip through. My crew gets a hold of their scanning tech, and you get one step ahead of Praxilla's leash. We use their tools against them." Violence. The idea sent a fresh wave of terror through the voices in his head. They screamed, not in his ears, but in the meat of his brain. He felt the phantom sensation of lungs filling with icy water, the crushing weight of the abyss. It was the memory of a dozen different deaths, all at once. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath hitching. "I can't," Jorin managed, his voice thin. "Using it makes it worse." Grendel scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "Worse than being vivisected by some compliance scientist in the spire? Deep and safe, Jorin. That's the choice.
Fight or let them carve you up to see what makes you tick." His 2 crew members, flanking the narrow entrance, shifted their weight. One fiddled with the grip of a pneumatic rivet gun. The other just stared, his eyes empty. Coercion had the texture of recycled air and the smell of Grendel's unwashed fatigues. Then a new presence. A figure stood in the entrance, silhouetted against the flickering blue neon of the sump corridor. He wasn't large like Grendel or armed like his men. He was still, so utterly still that he seemed to drink the frantic energy from the space. The rhythmic drip of condensation from a pipe above seemed louder in the sudden quiet. It was Hestian. The sump-rat mystic's clothes were patchwork of scavenged materials, but he wore them with a strange dignity. His face, illuminated by the clashing orange and blue light, was unnervingly calm. He looked past Grendel, his gaze finding Jorin's. "They are afraid," Hestian said. His voice was soft, yet it cut through the low thrum of the arcology's turbines. It wasn't a question.
Grendel straightened up, turning with a snarl. "Rust rot! Who let this sump rat out of his hole? Get lost, old man! This is private business!" Hestian didn't move. He simply stepped forward, placing himself calmly between Jorin and the Tide Lord. Grendel's men tensed, but Hestian's presence gave off no threat, only a disquieting certainty. "You would teach it to be a weapon," Hestian said, his eyes still locked on Jorin. The it hung in the air, understood by everyone. "You would show it how to break things, how to hurt, how to cause fear." The whispers in Jorin's mind, which had been a cacophony of shrieking panic, quieted. A single curious thought, not his own, surfaced. "Listen." "It's a parasite," Grendel spat, jabbing a finger toward Jorin. "A tool! You use a tool or it uses you. That's the only law down here." "Is that what you are? A tool?" Hestian asked Jorin directly. The question was gentle, but it landed like a physical blow. "The echo is a mirror, Jorin. It is a chorus. It learns what its hosts teach it. The first ones, the founders who died in the great outbreak, they taught it terror and madness. So that is what it learned to sing. You are teaching it your grief, your loss. It is learning to be you. If you teach it violence, it will only ever scream." Jorin's breath caught in his throat. Hestian's words resonated with a terrifying truth. When he thought of Lyanna, the echo gave him the salt sting of her final moments. When he felt fear, it gave him the drowning deaths of 100 strangers. It was a mirror, a horribly perfect, fractured mirror. "Ha! A mirror," Grendel sneered, the sound devoid of humor. "Listen to this mystic rot. He wants you to lie down and let the tide wash over you. He wants you to become a mushroom clinging to a pipe and humming to yourself while the world ends. That's not survival, that's surrender." "It is not surrender," Hestian countered, his calm infuriating the Tide Lord. "It is acceptance. It is finding the harmony in the chorus instead of trying to shout over it. The city groans because it is a machine, fighting the pressure. It is breaking. But what if it could learn to bend? What if it could learn to be part of the water instead of just fighting it? That is the gift inside you. Not to break walls, but to teach the bones of this city how to sing a new song." Jorin stared, caught between the 2 men, between 2 impossible futures. Grendel's path was one of action, of fighting,
of survival at any cost. It was a future of blood and rust and screaming. Hestian's path was one of stillness, of symbiosis, a quiet dissolution of the self into something else. A future of becoming part of the ghostly green-gold bioluminescence that clung to the walls, a silent hum in a city of ghosts. Both paths terrified him. Grendel's face darkened. He took a half-step toward Hestian, his hand balling into a fist. "You're filling his head with fantasies. He's a welder, not a god." "Are you so sure of the difference, down here?" Hestian murmured, his eyes glinting. That was it, the breaking point. Grendel saw in Jorin's wide eyes that the mystic's words had found purchase. The Tide Lord's strategy of blunt coercion was failing. He changed tack, backing away with a gesture of disgust. "Fine," Grendel snarled, his voice dropping to a low threat. "Fine, you stay here and listen to his ghost stories. But when Praxilla's hunters kick down that door, and they will, don't come crawling to me. The tide is rising, Jorin. You can learn to build a boat, or you can learn to drown gracefully." He turned and shouldered his way out of the alcove, his crew falling in behind him like shadows. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor, quickly swallowed by the omnipresent thrum of Amphitrite. Jorin was left in the dripping silence of the alcove, the oscillating blue and orange light painting the cramped space. He wasn't being coerced anymore. The immediate threat of Grendel was gone. But a far heavier weight settled onto his shoulders, the choice itself. He looked at Hestian, who hadn't moved, who simply watched him with an ancient, patient sadness. Two paths, a weapon or a song, violence or acceptance, break or bend. The whispers in his head were quiet now, waiting. For the first time, Jorin realized they weren't just screaming. They were listening.
The air in the Compliance Command Center was a lie. It was crisp, chilled, and cycled through ozone filters that scrubbed it of any human or mechanical odor. It was the scent of absolute control, a stark and deliberate fiction in a world defined by rust and brine. Here, in the Spire, 78 years of decay felt like a problem for another city. Chief Compliance Officer Praxilla Var preferred this lie. She stood before the grand holoschematic of Amphitrite, a shimmering blue ghost of the arcology that dominated the chamber. Her reflection, sharp and severe, was superimposed over the spire atrium, her dark uniform a void in the simulated light. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the stain at the bottom, the sump. Weeks ago, it had been a complex lattice of green and amber life sign indicators. Now it was a dead zone, a cauterized wound outlined in angry crimson. The great bulkheads, slammed shut by her order, had rendered it a black box, a tomb, or a crucible. Alert. Structural stress variance detected. Sump interior. Grid Gamma 7. Sub-level 4. The synthesized voice was as sterile as the air. Praxilla didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on the schematic, where a tiny, almost imperceptible web of hairline fractures now pulsed with a faint orange light. It was a bruise blooming on the city's bones. "Ma'am!" A voice young and tight with tension cut through the low hum of the servers. Analyst Kalen stood at his console, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the polished obsidian desk. "I have telemetry. It's not decay. The strain vectors are focal, deliberate." Praxilla turned her head slowly, an economical movement that conveyed absolute authority. Kalen was one of her best, a prodigy from the Spire's own eugenics program.
But he still possessed the fatal flaw of his generation, a belief in salvage. He believed broken things could be fixed. "Define deliberate, analyst," she said, her voice low and even. He swallowed, his eyes flicking between his screen and her unwavering stare. "The microfractures align with a series of unsanctioned energy discharges, brief, high-yield bursts. Someone is using cutter torches or something more powerful. They're bypassing internal pressure seals, forcing new routes through the decommissioned service ways." On the main schematic, Praxilla gestured, and a secondary window bloomed beside the sump. A stream of raw data scrolled past. Joule spikes, acoustic signatures, pressure differentials. Chaos quantified. To Kalen, it was a series of escalating emergencies. To Praxilla, it was a pattern. She saw the ghost of Grendel Brecker's ambition in the data, the tidal lord carving out a kingdom in the dark. Good. "The breaches are small," Kalen continued, his voice picking up speed, "but they're compromising the support struts in a critical load-bearing sector. If they continue, we could see a cascading failure. We can still reinforce the main bulkhead from our side, route plasma through the conduits, weld it shut permanently, cut them off from that section." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of professional urgency and a desperate human plea. He was still thinking in terms of architecture, of metal and stress points. He did not understand this was a biological problem now. Praxilla allowed the silence to hang in the air, the quiet hum of the room amplifying the weight of his own suggestion. She let him feel the weight of his own suggestion. She saw the hope drain from his face, replaced by confusion. "We will do nothing," she stated. It was not an opinion. It was a verdict. Kalen blinked. "Ma'am?" With respect, the models predict a 90% chance of localized collapse within 48 hours if these activities continue." "The hull is the whole, Analyst Kalen," she recited, the words of the city's core ideology sounding like a threat on her lips. "The sump is no longer a part of the whole. It is a gangrenous limb. One does not reinforce gangrene. One lets it rot so it can be cleanly excised." She walked over to his station, her polished boots making no sound on the floor. She looked down at his screen, at the angry red alerts and screaming data points. He saw a system failure. She saw a fever breaking. This internal conflict was a gift. Brecker's power grabs, his violent consolidation of territory, would do her work for her. He would gather the healthy and the desperate into one camp, and the echo-touched into another. He would draw lines in the dust, creating targets. He would expend resources, weaken the population, and accelerate the spread on the coral echo through the very pathways he was creating.
"But the uninvolved," Kalen whispered, barely audible. "The families, there are thousands of them. They're trapped between this internal faction and the infection." Praxilla felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a cold academic disappointment. Sentiment, the most dangerous contagion of all. "And you propose we risk our engineers, our resources, to save a population already sentenced? To what end? So they can die of the echo a week later, instead of a collapsing corridor tomorrow?" She tapped a command into his console. The frantic alerts were filtered out, replaced by a simple, clean graph tracking the sump's aggregate life signs, a slow, steady downward curve. "The infection is the crisis. Everything else is a symptom.
This internal conflict is a helpful symptom. It forces the disease to concentrate. It creates pressure. It hastens the end. She saw the truth in his eyes then, the dawning horror as he finally understood. He wasn't her subordinate in a mission to save the city. He was a lab assistant watching her run an experiment. He had been monitoring a rescue operation. She was curating a plague. Your recommendation is logged, analyst, and it is denied. Your new directive is to cease all predictive modeling for structural failure within the sump. You will focus exclusively on tracking biomass consolidation and echo propagation vectors. Do not alert me to falling debris. Alert me when one group has successfully exterminated the other. Do you understand? Kalen stared at the graph, at the clean mathematical representation of thousands of lives spiraling toward zero. He nodded, a single jerky motion. He didn't look up. "Deep and safe, Chief Officer," he mumbled, the standard greeting sounding like a curse.
Praxilla turned and walked back toward the main schematic. She watched the pulsing orange web in the sump's dark heart. It was a beautiful, chaotic process, a fire burning away the rot. The groans of stressed metal, which her sensors translated into data, were a song of purification. Let them fight. Let them break things. Let the infection burn through them until nothing was left but the echo's silence. She zoomed the schematic in, focusing on a single isolated cluster of green life signs in a sector far from Grendel's raids. A pocket of survivors holding out. For a moment, she watched the tiny flickering lights, each a universe of terror and hope. Then, with a flick of her finger, she dismissed the window, turning her attention back to the pristine, orderly glow of the spire. The work required patience. She had an abundance of it. The corridor was a dead end, choked with the smell of ozone and rust. Water wept down the curved metallic walls, catching the sickly orange glow of a single sodium work lamp and tracing paths through decades of grime. It was a place meant to be forgotten, a sealed artery in the city's deepest circulatory system. And at its terminus, a pressure door. Massive, circular, its surface pitted and stained. It looked less like a gateway and more like a tombstone. The stenciled red letters, Secondary Access 7C, Authorized Personnel Only, were faded to a pale ghost. "Well?" Grendel's voice was a gravelly scrape in the damp air. He stood just behind Jorin's shoulder, a hulking silhouette whose presence sucked the already thin air from the space. Two of his men, both armed with repurposed rivet guns that looked heavy and lethal, flanked them, their stances bored and menacing. "We don't have all cycle, Jorin. The compliance patrols are getting bolder." Jorin stared at the 4 maglocks surrounding the central wheel, each one a thick block of uncompromising steel. He could feel the low thrum of the city through the soles of his boots, a constant vibration that had been the soundtrack to his entire life. But now another frequency hummed beneath it, a whisper, a chorus. He shook his head, a barely perceptible motion. "I can't," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Grendel, this is rust-rot crazy. I'm a welder, not a key." "You were a welder," Grendel corrected, stepping closer. The scent of glimmer moss and cheap synthale rolled off him. Now you're something else. I saw what you did at the filtration manifold.
You didn't look. You didn't calculate. You just knew. You knew where the pipe would burst before it even groaned. This is the same thing, just bigger. That was an accident. It just happened. Jorin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His palms were slick with sweat. In the back of his mind, a woman's voice, sharp with academic annoyance, was complaining about sheared tolerances and shoddy composites. If the council had just approved the tungsten carbide alloy. The thought wasn't his. The voice wasn't his daughter's. It was new. It was cold and clear and terrifying. Accidents can be repeated, Grendel said, his patience fraying. One of his men shifted, and the heavy thud of his boot on the metal grill floor was like a hammer blow. This entire sector was designed by a single architectural team, first generation, before they started compartmentalizing the knowledge. The whispers you're hearing, the ones that aren't your little girl, some of them built this city. They know its secrets, and now so do you. So stop stalling. Grendel gestured at the door with his chin. Touch it. Jorin felt a knot of ice form in his gut. To actively use it, to reach into the cacophony and pull out a specific thread, that was different. That was consent. It was an invitation for the choral echo to dig its tendrils deeper, to root itself in the core of his will. He feared that if he did this once, he would never be able to stop. The ghost of his daughter, Liana, would be drowned out for good, lost in a sea of strangers. No, he breathed. I won't. A heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jorin flinched, his gaze darting to the man on his right. The man's face was a mask of impassive cruelty. His thumb rested near the trigger of the rivet gun. Don't make this difficult, Echo Boy, he grunted.
Grendel sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. Jorin, Jorin, Jorin. You're looking at this all wrong. This isn't a curse. It's a gift, a tool. It's the only thing that gives you value down here now that you're a fugitive. This door is locked. Behind it is a whole network of maintenance conduits they sealed off after the last tremor. Unlooted, unseen, full of salvage that will buy us supplies, time, and safety. Your safety. So you have two choices. You can be a key, or you can be a corpse. Now, touch the rust-rotted door. The choice wasn't a choice at all. Defeated, Jorin let out a shuddering breath. The sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the corridor. He turned slowly, facing the cold, weeping steel. The architect's voice was louder now, a phantom presence at the edge of his perception. Anya Sharma. My name was Anya Sharma. Her pride was a bitter tang in his mouth. Her frustration felt like his own. He raised his hands. They trembled, not from cold, but from sheer terror. His own hands felt alien to him, disconnected appendages. As his fingertips made contact with the door, a jolt, cold and electric, shot up his arms. It wasn't a physical shock, but a psychic one. The world of sound and orange light fell away, replaced by an interior landscape of impossible geometry. He closed his eyes. The hum of the city became a roar in his mind. The whispers of the drowned became a symphony. He saw it, not with his eyes, but with a sense he had no name for. He saw the door as a schematic of ghostly blue light floating in the darkness of his mind. He saw the intricate network of wires, the magnetic coils, the heavy, dense metal of the 4 primary locking bolts. Focus, Grendel's voice echoed from a world away. He didn't want to.
He wanted to pull away, to run, to scream until his throat was raw. But the architect, Anya, was there. Her knowledge was a map, and his fear was the vehicle. He pushed through the panicked cries of drowning men and the final gurgling breaths of breach victims. He found her. He felt her clinical, dispassionate understanding of the mechanism she had designed. Bolt Gamma 7, her memory supplied. The upper left quadrant. The contractor used a substandard molybdenum blend. A yield strength 8.7% below spec. A flaw hidden in the casting. A point of failure. He could feel it. He could feel the crystalline structure of the metal, the microscopic fractures waiting under immense, dormant pressure. He felt the stored kinetic energy coiled within it like a serpent. It was an instrument, and Anya's memory was showing him precisely where to strike the killing blow. He was no longer just Jorin. He was the welder, the grieving father, the fugitive. And he was also Anya Sharma, the long-dead architect, filled with a phantom sense of professional indignation. The fusion of their intent, his desperation, and her ghostly pride coalesced into a single point of unbearable pressure. He didn't scream with his voice. The scream was inside his head, a silent, white-hot spike of pure will directed at that single, flawed point in space and time. Crack! The sound was absolute, a violent percussive explosion of shearing metal that deafened him, that vibrated through his teeth and into his skull. It was 1,000 times louder than a falling wrench, louder than a whole groan. It was the sound of the world breaking. Jorin was thrown back by the psychic recoil, stumbling into Grendel, who caught him roughly. His eyes snapped open. The orange light of the corridor seemed blinding. The smell of ozone was sharp and acrid, mixed with the new, clean scent of superheated steel. On the grimy floor, nestled amongst the rust flakes, lay the bolt. A solid cylinder of metal as thick as his arm, sheared cleanly in two. The break was polished to a mirror shine, so hot it warped the air above it. The upper left maglock on the door was dark, its housing split open like a ripe fruit. Jorin stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. Then he looked at his own hands. They were just hands, flesh and bone and dirt under the nails. But they had just done that. He had just done that. The terror he'd felt before was nothing. This was a new and bottomless emotion, a dawning soul-shattering horror at his own monstrous capability. Grendel let out a low, guttural laugh. It was not a sound of humor, but of triumph. He shoved Jorin aside gently, his eyes gleaming as he inspected the broken lock. "See?" Grendel's voice was a low murmur, almost intimate. "Just a tool. A beautiful, one-of-a-kind tool." He nodded to his men. "Open." One of the thugs holstered his rivet gun and put his shoulder to the heavy door. With the primary bolt gone, it groaned, resisted, then swung inward with a shriek of tortured metal, revealing a passage of absolute, silent blackness. As Grendel and his men moved to step into the dark, Jorin remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the impossible, perfect break in the severed bolt. He hadn't just opened a door. He had cracked open his own soul and let the abyss look through. The silence was the first violation. In the sump, silence didn't exist. Life was measured by the deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, a vibration felt in the teeth and bones. It was the groan of stressed metal, the hiss of hydraulic lines, the cacophony of 10,000 lives crammed into a cage of repurposed steel. Now, with the sump's great bulkhead slammed shut and the power severed, a new sound had taken over. The sound of nothing. It was a pressure in the ears, a void that amplified the rhythmic drip of condensation onto the grated floor and the scuff of their own boots. Jorin moved behind Grendel Brecker, the tidal lord's bulk a dark silhouette against the sickly orange of an emergency lamp. Two of Grendel's men, Kael and Barris, brought up the rear, their salvaged pulse rifles held tight. The air was thick with the familiar sump perfume, rust, ozone, and damp, but underneath it was something else. Stagnation, the smell of a sealed tomb. For Jorin, the external quiet was a mockery. Inside his skull, the chorus of the drowned never ceased. It was 1,000 panicked final thoughts, a library of deaths by water, all vying for attention. It made the stillness of this residential corridor feel like a personal attack. "Keep your eyes open," Grendel grunted, his voice a low scrape in the oppressive quiet. "We cut through Hab Block Gamma. Should be quicker." They turned a corner, and the whole group froze. In the recessed doorway of a container hab, a family of 4 stood perfectly still. Father, mother, 2 children. Their heads were cocked at the exact same angle, their eyes wide and unfocused. They weren't looking at the corridor or at the intruders. They were staring intently at a patch of wet bulkhead where a filigree of green-gold bioluminescent fungus pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. They weren't breathing in unison, but the utter lack of any other movement, no shifting of weight, no blinking, made it seem so.
Coral, the jumpier of Grendel's men, let out a choked sound.
"Rust rot, what are they doing?"
"Nothing," Grendel snapped, not turning his head. "They're doing nothing, and so are we. Move." But Jorin couldn't look away. The manic static in his head, the overlapping screams and prayers of the echo, seemed to recede, just for a second. The chaos resolved into a low, resonant hum, a frequency that matched the one he felt emanating from the silent family. It was a feeling of placid emptiness, a horrifying peace. The echo in him recognized the echo in them. It was a greeting. He felt Grendel's hand shove his shoulder. "Jorin, now." He tore his eyes away, the cacophony crashing back into his thoughts, and followed. They passed another open doorway. Inside, a woman stood before a small metal table. She held a damp rag, and with a slow, metronomic grace, she was polishing a single spot on the table's surface. Back and forth, left and right. The movement was impossibly smooth, a perfect, repeatable motion with no beginning and no end. Her face was as serene and empty as a doll's. "They're not sick," Barris muttered from behind, his voice tight. "They're not violent. They're just wrong." Wrong. Jorin rolled the word around in his mind. It wasn't the right word. A burst pipe was wrong. A cracked weld was wrong. This was a recalculation, a new equation being solved. He could almost feel the logic of it, a cold, alien sense of purpose that rippled beneath his own terror. He was a welder. He understood stress, patterns, how systems behave under pressure. He was watching a social system fail, but instead of collapsing into chaos, it was crystallizing into a new, terrifying order. They moved past a small, recessed common area meant for children. A half-dozen kids were on the floor. They weren't playing.
They had gathered a small pile of discarded hex bolts and were arranging them on the grimy floor. Each child would pick up a bolt, pause for a moment, and place it, contributing to a vast, intricate spiral. Their small hands moved with the same slow, synchronized deliberation. No chatter, no laughter, just the soft, rhythmic clink of metal on metal. It was a choir practicing in a key he was only just beginning to hear. A silent choir. Coral made a whimpering sound. "It's the water, boss. They're all touched. We should put them down."
"Put your weapon down, you rust-rotted idiot," Grendel hissed, his voice a blade of controlled fury. "They're not a threat. They're scenery. We have to get to the primary conduits before Praxilla's goons figure out a way through the bulkheads. Wasting ammo on statues isn't part of the plan." They finally reached the main nexus of the hab block, a large multi-level common area that once served as a mess hall. And here the true scale of it became clear. Dozens of people, maybe 100. They filled the space, but made no sound. Some stood on the lower level, some on the grated catwalks above. None of them spoke, none of them moved, save for one single coordinated motion. As one, they were all slowly, almost imperceptibly turning. Like sunflowers tracking a dead star, their bodies were angled toward the center of the room. In the center sat the district's primary water reclamation tank, a huge cylindrical monolith of dark metal that rose 2 stories high. It was usually the loudest thing in the block, a constant churn and gurgle of filtration. Now it was dead silent. The water inside was perfectly still. But it wasn't black. Through the grimy viewing portals, a faint ghostly green-gold light pulsed from within. The soft internal glow of 1 billion coral echo microorganisms thriving in the stagnant water. They were worshipping it, a congregation at the heart of their own contamination. The sight broke something in Kael. Jorin heard the click of the safety being disengaged on his pulse rifle. "No," he stammered, his voice trembling. "No, this is the end of everything." "Kael!" Grendel spun, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and shoving it towards the floor. "I said stand down. You fire one shot in here, you give away our position for nothing." Jorin didn't hear the rest. He was transfixed by the tank. The low hum in his skull was vibrating in perfect harmony with the light pulsing from the water. The panicked voices of the drowned were fading, being absorbed into that single pure tone. He felt the tension in his own muscles wanting to release, his head wanting to loll to the side, his feet wanting to turn and join the silent watching crowd. It was a promise, an end to the pain, an end to the memories of Liana, of the breach, of the guilt, an end to him. It was the silence he'd been craving, offered to him not as peace, but as total dissolution. Then a new voice cut through the hum. It was not a memory. It was not the fragmented terror of a stranger. It was clear, calm, and felt like it was coming from the tank itself, speaking directly into the core of his mind. "Join us, Jorin. Be still. Be whole." The air in Grendel's hub was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of sweat, rust, and the sharp, clean burn of ozone from the jury-rigged holo projector at the center of the room. The space, a repurposed maintenance nexus for a decommissioned pump station, was packed with the desperate dregs of the sump. Gaunt-faced hull clingers with eyes as hollow as spent jewel chits stood shoulder to shoulder with Grendel's core of Tide Lords, their brutish frames coiled with a nervous energy that vibrated through the grated floor. Jorin stood near the back,
leaning against a bulkhead slick with condensation and faintly glowing fungi. The crowd's fear was a physical presence, a low-frequency hum that resonated with the deeper thrum of the city's dying heart. He felt it not with his ears, but in the marrow of his bones, a frequency the choral echo understood intimately. It was the sound of trapped things. In his head, the whispers were a constant static, a chorus of final moments. "The pressure! God's the pressure!" a welder from a decade past. "Can't find a latch!" a technician lost in a flooded conduit. They were a part of him now, as inseparable from his thoughts as the memory of his own daughter's hand slipping from his grasp. Liana's voice was fainter these days, a single pure note nearly lost in the dissonant choir. At the center of the room, bathed in the sickly blue light of the schematic he'd summoned, stood Grendel Brecker. The Tide Lord wasn't speaking, he was preaching. His voice, a powerful baritone honed by years of shouting over industrial noise, filled every corner of the chamber. "Look at you," he boomed, arms spread wide. "Look at what Praxillivar and her spire-born lapdogs have made us. Rats in a cage. They sealed us in, cut our power, bled our water. They are waiting for us to grow silent, to die quietly so they can scrub our homes clean of our memory." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. Grendel let it build, his face a mask of righteous fury, his eyes glittering with something more dangerous than anger. It was the wild, feverish light of a gambler staking everything on a final, impossible hand.
But we are not rats. We are the sump. We are the hands that hold this city together, the blood and the iron that Amphitrite was built on, and we will not go silent into the deep. The roar that answered him was ragged but real. It was the sound of fear being forged into a weapon. Jorin watched, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Grendel was a master of this dark alchemy. He wasn't offering hope, he was offering rage, a much more potent fuel in a place like this. Grendel stabbed a thick finger at the hollow schematic. It flickered, resolving into a cross-section of their prison. A massive blood-red slab dominated the image, labeled Quarantine Bulkhead 7. Running parallel to it, a hair's breadth away, was a thick, pulsing blue line. "This," Grendel said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that forced everyone to lean in, "is our way out. The Spire-born, in their infinite wisdom, built their wall right alongside Sump Primary Reclamation Conduit 3, the main artery for this entire district's recycled water." Jorin's focus snapped to the blue line. The whispers in his head fell silent, replaced by a single deafening hum. He didn't just see a schematic, he felt it. He felt the immense slashing weight of 1,000,000 liters of water. He felt the strain on the ferroceramic joints, the microscopic fissures blooming and healing along its length. The choral echo inside him was a part of that conduit too, a diluted but present extension of himself. The conduit was alive in his mind, a slumbering serpent of unthinkable pressure. "The bulkhead is a meter of solid trimetallic carbide. No cutter can touch it. No explosive we have could dent it. To them, it's absolute, impenetrable." He let the word hang in the ozone-laced air. But they forgot about the water. They forgot what happens when you apply the right pressure in the right place. He turned, and his eyes found Jorin in the shadows. The entire room followed his gaze, 100 pairs of desperate, hungry eyes fixed on him. The collective hope was a physical weight, crushing him more than any abyssal trench. "We have a key,"
Grendel announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "A man who doesn't need a plasma torch. A man who can speak to the groaning metal of this city in its own language."
He pointed directly at Jorin. "He is going to reach out, and he is going to tell that conduit to break." The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any Jorin had ever known in Amphitrite. It was the silence of disbelief warring with frantic, desperate hope. He could feel their thoughts, their fears. The echo touched. A monster, our savior. A woman near the front, her face skeletal, whispered the question on everyone's mind. "Break it, but the flood—" Grendel laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Exactly! A controlled rupture. A catastrophic structural failure. The resulting explosion, a hammer of pressurized water and shattered ceramic, will hit that bulkhead like the fist of a god. It won't just open the door for us. It will tear the door from its hinges. It will show Praxilla Var what happens when she cages the deep." Fanatical desperation. Jorin saw it now. Grendel's confidence was a thin shell over a core of pure, suicidal gambling. This wasn't a plan. It was a tantrum armed with a doomsday weapon. The voices in Jorin's head returned, a chaotic storm of warnings. Not moral objections, but cold engineering facts. The cascade, secondary stress fractures, the floor plating won't hold. They showed him visions, the conduit peeling open like rotten fruit, a white wall of water atomizing everything in its path, the bulkhead buckling, yes, but also the support structures for the level above them screaming and twisting. "That's not a key, Jorin." His voice was a raw croak, barely audible over the hum. "It's a bomb. You'll kill us all, them and us." Grendel stalked toward him, his face losing its charismatic mask, revealing the hard-edged title lord beneath. "It's a chance. It's the only chance they left us," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "They are killing us slowly. I am offering a quick death or a path out. At least it's a choice." He was close now, his breath smelling of stale nutrient paste. "I saw what you did at the junction. I know what you can do. You just have to focus. Let the monster out of its cage for a few seconds. For all of us." Jorin looked past Grendel at the faces of the crowd. They weren't seeing a plan anymore. They were seeing a miracle, a dark, terrifying, beautiful miracle. They were starving, sick, and trapped, and this madman was offering them a thunderbolt to smite their enemies. Grendel stepped back, turning to his army one last time. His voice dropped the pretense of conspiracy and took on the finality of a death sentence. "They think we are drowning," he said, his gaze sweeping over the haunted faces. "Let's give them a tide they will never forget." He turned back to Jorin, his expression a chilling mixture of command and plea. "Are you with us, Jorin, or are you going to let us rot in here with the ghosts in your head?" The question hung in the air, sucking the remaining oxygen from the room. 100 desperate souls held their breath, their collective will a suffocating pressure. They looked at him, their eyes burning with a terrible misplaced faith. They no longer saw a man, a welder, a grieving father. They saw a weapon, their weapon, and they were begging him to fire. The march through the sump's decaying arteries was a funeral procession, and I was the corpse. Grendel's men, 4 of them, held my arms in grips like rusted vices. Their faces were hollowed-out masks of desperation, lit by the sickly orange glow of failing sodium lamps.
Every footstep echoed off the weeping metal walls, a percussive beat against the city's low, constant groan. My own feet shuffled, dragged. Resignation was a lead weight in my gut, heavier than any exosuit. The whispers of the choral echo had receded to a dull hum, a background frequency of drowned lives that was almost comforting in its familiarity. Almost. One of Grendel's men, a kid with fear-bright eyes and a jaw clenched so tight his teeth might shatter, shoved me forward. "Move it, Echo Freak!" I didn't resist. Where was there to go? The sump was a sealed tomb, and Grendel was just a more ambitious undertaker. He walked ahead of us, his heavy frame silhouetted against the gloom, the salvaged rivet gun he carried pointing toward our destination. He was a Tide Lord marching to war, and I was his siege weapon.
We rounded a final, dripping corner, and the corridor opened into a cavernous chamber. Main Conduit Access Junction 7. The air grew thick, tasting of ozone and something else, something deeply organic, like a tide pool left to rot in the dark. In the center of the grated floor sat the reason we were here, a massive circular pressure hatch, its iron wheel crusted with decades of rust and grime. Pipes snaked across the ceiling and walls like the calcified entrails of a leviathan. And blocking our path, standing in a silent, unwavering line before the hatch, were Hestian and his followers. There were perhaps a dozen of them. They weren't armed. They weren't shouting. They were simply there. A human wall of unnerving calm. Their skin, visible in the patchy light from a buzzing maintenance panel, seemed to have a faint pearlescent quality. Phosphorescent fungi, the same kind that painted the deep-sea vents, clung to their threadbare clothes, casting a ghostly green-gold light on their serene faces. They were the echo-touched, and they looked more at home in this dying place than any of us. My breath caught. The hum in my skull intensified, resonating with their presence. A voice, not mine, not Liana's, bubbled up from the collective. They listen. They hear the song. Grendel stopped, his boots scuffing on the grate. He let out a short, contemptuous puff of air. "Rust rot. I knew you'd be here, moss chewer." Hestian stood at the center of the line. He was thin, almost skeletal, but his posture held an impossible stillness. His eyes, dark and wide, found mine. They weren't filled with pity or fear, but with a profound, sorrowful understanding. "Jorin," he said, his voice soft but carrying across the junction with unnatural clarity. "Brother, do not let them do this." Grendel laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Get out of the way, Hestian. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns the whole," Hestian replied, his gaze never leaving me. "They wish to use the song as a scream, a weapon. It is meant to be a chorus, a joining." He took a single, slow step forward. "They see a key to a cage. We see a door to a new ocean. You feel it, don't you? The end of being alone." His words vibrated through me. Yes, God, yes, I felt it. The promise of the echo wasn't just noise. It was an end to the crushing, singular weight of my own grief. To be a drop of water, no longer a single, isolated tear. The thought was both terrifying and seductive. My body swayed, a pull toward him, toward that silent, collective peace. "He's a tool, you lunatic,"
Grendel barked, gesturing with the rivet gun. "He's gonna get us through those bulkheads. He's gonna give us a voice up in the spire they can't ignore." He took a menacing step toward Hestian. "Now for the last time, move!" Hestian did not flinch. He simply raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "The hull is not the whole," he said, his voice dropping lower, imbued with a strange resonance. "The city is a shell. It is brittle. The water is eternal. Don't fight it, Jorin. Just breathe." For a moment, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. The groaning of stressed metal faded. The drip of condensation stopped. All I could hear was the tidal pull of the echo in my head, 1,000 voices whispering a single word: "Listen." Then Grendel broke the spell. "Enough!" He nodded to his men. The two not holding me surged forward. There was no finesse, only brutal, desperate force. They slammed into the human chain. Hestian's followers didn't fight back. They tried to hold their ground, their bodies absorbing the blows with soft grunts of pain. A woman with shimmering patterns on her cheeks was thrown against a coolant pipe, her head cracking against the metal with a wet thud. Another man was kicked in the stomach and collapsed, curling into a ball on the grating. It was pathetic. It was a massacre of ideals by blunt force. Hestian stood his ground until one of Grendel's men, a brute with a thick neck and dead eyes, smashed the butt of a heavy wrench into his shoulder. Hestian cried out, a sharp, bird-like sound, and stumbled back, breaking the line. And something inside me snapped. The resignation, the leaden weight in my soul vaporized in a flash of white-hot rage. It wasn't just my rage. It was the terror of a dozen drowning souls, the fury of 100 broken lives, all focusing into a single point. Hestian had offered peace. Grendel had answered with violence. He was trying to turn their chorus into a scream. With a roar that was not my own, I threw my weight back. The man holding my right arm, the kid with the scared eyes, yelped in surprise as my elbow connected with his ribs. He staggered, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. I twisted, my body moving with a speed and strength that felt alien, borrowed. I wrenched my arm free and drove my fist into the face of the man on my left. He went down hard. The other two turned, their expressions shifting from grim determination to shock. For a second, they saw me, not the broken welder, not the grieving father. They saw the thing I was becoming. "Hold him!" Grendel bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. The two men, plus the one I'd hit in the ribs, swarmed me. I fought. I kicked and punched and thrashed with the strength of a cornered animal. My knuckles scraped raw against someone's jaw. A heavy blow landed on my back, stealing my breath. The echo screamed in my head, a cacophony of pain and fear from 1,000 other struggles, 1,000 other last stands. I was stronger than I should have been, but there were too many. They were desperate. They dragged me down, my knees hitting the cold, unforgiving grate with a painful crack. Hands clawed at me, pinning my arms, my legs. I twisted my head, spitting a mouthful of blood and brine onto the metal floor, and locked eyes with Grendel. He stood over me, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fury and fear. "You want to fight?" he snarled, pressing the cold nozzle of the rivet gun to my temple. "Fight for us! Fight to get us out!" He didn't understand. Hestian did. The fight wasn't to get out. The fight was to stop being a tool, to stop being a key, to stop being anything but the repository of ghosts I had become. But I had lost. They hauled me to my feet, my final burst of defiance extinguished. My muscles screamed, but the fire inside was banked to embers. They dragged me the last few feet, my boots scraping uselessly against the grate, and forced me onto my knees before the great iron wheel of the conduit hatch. Grendel loomed over me, a jailer presenting a prisoner to the gallows. Beyond him, Hestian was slowly getting to his feet, one hand clutching his injured shoulder, his face a portrait of infinite, tragic failure. The air and main conduit access junction 7 was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of ozone, rust, and the damp, earthy smell of the sump's ever-present fungal blooms. It clung to the back of Jorin's throat. A single sodium vapor work lamp cast a sickly orange pall over the chamber, making the dripping walls sweat. In the center of the cramped space, a colossal pipe dominated everything, the primary reclamation conduit. It was as wide as 3 men lying end to end, its surface slick with black condensation and patches of ghostly green-gold bioluminescence that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a sleeping lung. The deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite was louder here, a physical vibration that resonated in Jorin's bones, a constant reminder of the crushing weight above and the seething pressure below. Grendel Brecker stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of impatient granite in the flickering light. His remaining 2 Tidal Lords flanked him, rifles held loosely but ready. Their eyes, accustomed to the sump's gloom, darted towards every drip and metallic creak. "Well?" Grendel's voice was a low growl that cut through the humming quiet. "We don't have all cycle, Jorin. Every second we waste here is a second Praxilla's compliance dogs get closer to sniffing our trail. Open it!" Jorin didn't move. He stared at the conduit, at the faint light that seemed to answer the altered biology of his own body. He could feel it. The choral echo wasn't just a noise in his head anymore. It was a presence in the room. A vast and ancient intelligence coiled within the city's metallic arteries. It was aware of them. It was listening. "This isn't like cracking a maglock, Grendel," Jorin said, his voice raw, strained. The chorus in his mind was a low tide of whispers, thousands of voices murmuring just below the threshold of comprehension. They were agitated. "It's not a mechanism. It's watching us." Grendel let out a short, derisive huff of air. "Everything in this rust bucket is a mechanism. You just have to find the lever. You're the one who can hear the machine's thoughts, aren't you? So get it to do what we want. Bypass the quarantine lockdown on Sector Gamma. Give us a way out of this cage." He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing Jorin. Sanctuary, Jorin thought. A cage within a cage. He knew Grendel was right about one thing. Their time was running out. He could feel the city's fear, a new texture in the echo's symphony of memory. He took a hesitant step toward the conduit. The whispers in his head began to swell, rising in pitch and volume. He saw flashes, not his memories, but theirs. A welder's torch flaring out, a child's hand slipping from a mother's grasp in rising water, the sudden shocking cold of a hull breach. He had to focus. He had to find the single thread he needed, the conduit's flow control schematic, the memory of the engineer who designed it, a ghost archived within the echo. He closed his eyes, trying to push back the tide, to impose his will on an ocean. "It resists," he murmured, more to himself than to Grendel. "Then push harder," Grendel snapped. Do it! Jorin took a final shuddering breath and placed his mutated hands, the skin now unnaturally pale and threaded with faint phosphorescent veins, onto the cold, weeping metal of the conduit. The world vanished. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical impact. A billion voices screaming as one. A tidal wave of pure, undiluted consciousness slammed into him, a force of gravity that threatened to crush his own identity into a single, meaningless atom. He was 1,000 people at once. He was a technician from the spire, feeling the vertigo of looking down into the abyss. He was a first-generation child, tasting real sunlight for the first and last time. He was a diver whose helmet cracked, his lungs filling with the icy burn of the deep, the pressure collapsing his world into a point of black agony. He felt their love, their hate, their terror, their banal boredom all at once, a deafening, soul-shredding cacophony. "Get out!" they screamed without words. "You are a tool. You are a weapon. We will not be wielded." The collective consciousness of the echo, ancient and vast, recoiled from the petty intrusion of Grendel's plan. It wasn't just refusing, it was fighting back, trying to swallow the part of itself that Jorin now represented. Jorin felt his own memories, Lyanna's face, the smell of Ildric's workshop, shredding like rust-eaten paper. He was dissolving.
With a strangled cry, he tore his hands away from the conduit, stumbling backward as if he'd touched a high-voltage line. He collapsed against the far bulkhead, sliding down the slick metal to the floor, gasping. The air burned in his lungs. The chorus in his head receded to a furious, roaring hiss. He was still himself, barely. Grendel stared at him, his face contorted with rage and utter disgust. "Rust rot, you had one job, all that power, all this freakishness, and for what? You're useless." Jorin looked up, his vision swimming. "Grendel, don't," he rasped, the words tearing at his throat. "You don't understand. It's not a system to be hacked. It's alive. It's angry." The Tidal Lord didn't listen. His eyes were fixed on the conduit, gleaming with a frustrated, predatory hunger. The arrogance that had made him a king in the Sump's black markets now curdled into pure, reckless hubris. He saw only an obstacle, a lock that refused to turn. "Give me that," he snarled, shoving Jorin's prone form with his boot. He strode to the conduit, contempt radiating from him like heat. "You coddle it. You treat it like some kind of ghost. But it's just pressure. It's just a prurient. You just have to know how to show it who's boss." He cracked his knuckles, a sharp, ugly sound in the humming chamber. He looked back at Jorin's crumpled form one last time, a smirk twisting his lips. "Fine, I'll do it myself." With a grunt of exertion, Grendel slammed both of his bare, calloused palms flat against the conduit's bioluminescent surface. For one perfect, silent second, nothing happened. The conduit just hummed. The water dripped. Grendel's smirk widened, a look of vindication. Then, the green-gold light on the conduit's surface did not just flare. It surged. It erupted from the point of contact, not as light, but as a liquid, living substance, crawling up Grendel's hands and arms like phosphorescent vines. It moved with terrifying speed and purpose, sinking through his skin, illuminating his veins from within.
Grendel's eyes went wide. The smirk vanished, replaced by a look of profound, absolute shock. His mouth opened, but the scream he intended was stillborn. A choked, wet gurgle escaped his lips as his jaw worked spasmodically. It was the sound of a man trying to speak 1,000 words at once, trying to process an entire ocean of souls being force-fed into his mind in a single, brutal instant. His body began to twitch, then convulse, his own muscles fighting a war against the billion new signals now commanding them. His face, illuminated from within by the ghostly green light, was a canvas of pure, uncomprehending horror as the choral echo began to unmake him. The air in main conduit access junction 7 was thick enough to taste. It was a cocktail of sharp ozone, the dap metallic tang of rust, and something else, something deeper, a loamy organic scent like a freshly opened grave dug in wet soil. The junction was a nexus of the city's metallic guts, a knot of colossal pipes and conduits that thrummed with the ceaseless flow of power from the taps. Sickly orange work lamps cast long distorted shadows, while patches of ghostly green-gold fungi clung to the perpetually weeping bulkheads. But it was the conduit itself that held Jorin's gaze. It wasn't just metal anymore. A faint, rhythmic pulse of light moved beneath its corroded surface, a sickly bioluminescence that mirrored the shimmer on his own skin. He could feel it, a slow, silent hum that wasn't sound, but a vibration in his bones, a resonance with the part of him that was no longer just him. "Damn it, Jorin, stop staring." Grendel's voice was a percussive blast in the oppressive quiet. The Tide Lord brandished a heavy industrial spanner, his knuckles white. "We don't have time for your trances. The compliance patrols will be sweeping this level again before the shift bell. Just touch it. Feel for the stress point like you did with the water main." Jorin didn't turn. The voices in his head, the choir of the drowned, were a low, whispering tide. They weren't panicked. They were observing, cataloging. He could feel their collective curiosity focused on Grendel, on the hot spike of anger and aggression the man radiated. It was a dissonant, painful note in the deep, resonant symphony of the conduit. "No." Jorin's voice was a dry rasp torn from a throat that felt alien. "It's aware."
Grendel let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "Huh, aware. It's a pipe, you rust-rotted ghost, a big, dumb pipe carrying power. Now are you going to help me find a seam to crack this glorified can, or do I have to resort to good old-fashioned persuasion?" He took a threatening step forward, hefting the spanner. Jorin finally tore his eyes from the wall and looked at the Tidal Lord. He saw a man blind to the abyss he was shouting into. He saw a predator who thought he was at the top of the food chain, utterly oblivious to the true Leviathan sleeping beneath his feet. The echo in Jorin's mind offered him 1,000 fragments of knowledge, the precise tensile strength of the spanner, the trajectory of the swing, the brittle point in Grendel's own collarbone. The knowledge was a weapon, but using it felt wrong. It felt like playing Grendel's game. "Don't. You'll only make it angry." "Make it angry?" Grendel's face twisted in disbelief. "You've really lost it, haven't you? The whispers finally ate your brain? Fine." He spat on the grated floor. "If you won't use the gift, I'll use good old-fashioned force. This whole section is biomineralized, you said. It heals itself. That means it can break." He turned his back on Jorin, approaching the main conduit. The rhythmic glow within seemed to brighten, the pace of its pulse quickening. Jorin felt a change in the resonance, a shift from passive observation to focused attention. The silent chorus in his head grew a fraction louder. Threat, dissonance, correction required. "Grendel, wait!" Jorin pleaded, his own hand raising involuntarily, his mutated skin crawling with a sudden freezing dread. Grendel ignored him.
He squared his shoulders, planting his feet. To get the proper leverage for a swing, he placed his free hand flat against the conduit's surface. "Here we go," he grunted. "A little percussion maintenance to get us through." The instant his palm made contact, everything changed.
It wasn't a violent explosion. It was a growth, cancerous, crystalline, fractal. Dozens of pale, ivory-colored tendrils, like biomineralized coral, burst from the metal. They were impossibly fast. They wrapped around Grendel's fingers, his wrist, his forearm, not like vines, but like hungry flesh. The material was both solid and fluid, digging under his skin, fusing with his tissues. The fabric of his coveralls tore with a wet, ripping sound. He tried to scream. A raw, piercing sound of pure agony and terror began to form in his throat, but it was choked off as more growths burst from the wall and swarmed over his chest and face. One thick tendril, glowing with that same internal light, forced its way into his open mouth. The scream was cut to a single wet, muffled shriek. Jorin stood paralyzed, a witness to a horror he was intimately connected to. He could feel it. Through the echo in his own veins, he felt the cold, systematic process of assimilation. He felt Grendel's consciousness, a supernova of panic, pain, and violent outrage, being forcibly downloaded, archived, and extinguished. It wasn't killing him. It was filing him away. Grendel's body was pulled grotesquely into the wall. He didn't fall. He was absorbed. His limbs were stretched and distorted, his torso flattened, his very bones seeming to dissolve as the biomineral mass integrated him into its structure. For a few horrifying seconds, his form was a struggling, twitching bas-relief on the surface of the conduit, a face contorted in a silent scream, a hand still clutching the spanner, before the pulsating material flowed over him, smoothing the surface. The spanner fell to the grated floor with a lonely, echoing clang. Where Grendel had stood, there was now only a vaguely human-shaped discoloration on the conduit, a darker patch of rust and weeping moisture. The brilliant light receded, and the rhythmic, gentle pulse returned, now flowing through the new mass. The junction was quiet again. The dissonance was gone. The echo was calm. Satisfied. The choir in Jorin's head swelled for a brief, agonizing moment with the ghost of Grendel's final desperate thought, "It's eating me," before the voice was subsumed, becoming just another anonymous whisper in the vast, silent library of the drowned.
Jorin stumbled backward, his breath catching in his lungs. He finally hit the opposing bulkhead and slid down to the floor, wrapping his arms around himself. The act of assimilation hadn't just been something he'd seen. It was a process he'd understood on a cellular level. It was a warning. It was a demonstration. He looked down at his own hands, at the faint, ghostly shimmer of light that pulsed just beneath his skin. He was a part of it. The echo was in him, and the echo was the city. Grendel had tried to fight it with force, to break it, and it had simply absorbed him, correcting the error. It didn't break. It didn't yield. It only grew. Abject terror, cold and absolute, washed over him. There was no fighting this. There was no winning. There was only running, or surrendering. He scrambled to his feet, a single desperate objective crystallizing in the screaming chaos of his mind. The taps. He had to get to the taps. It was the heart of the city, the heart of the echo. It was the only place left where any choice was possible at all. Time had ceased to be a line. It was a frozen lake, and Jorin was trapped beneath the ice. He stood in the echoing cavern of main conduit access junction 7. his gaze fixed on the bulkhead where a man had just ended. It wasn't a smear of blood or a scorch mark. It was worse. The rust-pocked weeping steel Grendel had been slammed against was now alive. A fractal lattice of pearlescent coral-like growth pulsed with a soft internal green-gold light, spreading from a central point in delicate biomineralized veins. It looked like a fossil of a lightning strike captured in mother-of-pearl. The air, usually thick with the tang of ozone and rust, now carried a new scent underneath it all, a strange, clean smell like cold copper and the abyssal deep. Grendel wasn't on the wall. Grendel was the wall. The last thing Jorin remembered was the Tidal Lord's furious, terrified roar dissolving into a harmonic chord, a sound that settled into the city's constant groan as if it had always been there. Jorin's limbs were locked. His breath was a shallow, useless thing in his chest. The cacophony in his head, the constant chorus of the drowned, had fallen silent. For the first time in weeks, there was a stillness in his mind, and it was more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of utter, soul-shattering shock. He could feel the memory trying to replay, the grotesque, beautiful way the choral echo had swarmed, not to attack, but to welcome. How Grendel's flesh and clothes and chrome-plated pistol had unraveled into threads of light and matter, woven into the bulkhead with the horrifying precision of a biomechanical loom. He saw the Tide Lord's eyes, wide with a final, agonizing moment of understanding before they filmed over with the same pearlescent sheen that now pulsed gently on the wall. He was going to be sick, or scream, or just fall apart, his atoms unspooling just like Grendel's. He couldn't move. He could only stare at the living tombstone. Then, a touch. A hand, surprisingly warm and dry, settled on his shoulder. Jorin flinched so violently his teeth clicked together, a full-body shudder that finally broke the paralysis. He stumbled back, turning to see Hestian standing there, his face a mask of profound, ancient sorrow. The Sumprat mystic wasn't looking at Jorin, but at the shimmering patch on the wall. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "He would not listen," Hestian said, his voice a low, mournful hum that barely rose above the dripping of condensation from a massive pipe overhead. "He tried to punch the tide. He saw the ocean as a wall to be broken, not a current to join." The words didn't make sense. Jorin's mind was still trying to claw its way out of the frozen lake. He was... Jorin couldn't find the word. Assimilated? Eaten? He was answered, Hestian corrected softly, finally turning his gaze to Jorin. His eyes, clear and unnervingly calm, held no fear, only a deep, bottomless pity. "The echo is a conversation, Jorin. Grendel screamed at it, and it screamed back in the only language it knows, the language of union." Jorin stared at him, the horror curdling into a knot of cold fury in his stomach. The voices in his head began to seep back in, no longer a cacophony, but a low, insidious whisper. "One of us. One water, one deep."
Union? Jorin's own voice was a raw croak. "He's gone, Hestian. He was dissolved into a glowing patch of fungus."
"He is not gone," Hestian said, stepping closer.
He gestured to the wall, then swept his hand out to indicate the entirety of the groaning, dripping junction.
"He is here, and here. He is part of the foundation now. His strength holds this conduit together. His anger is a memory. His fear is a lesson. He is no longer just Grendel, a single screaming voice. He is a note in the song. Jorin looked from Hestian's placid face to the shimmering, breathing wall. He thought of Grendel's brutal, pragmatic violence, his desperate attempt to carve out power and control in a world that was collapsing around them. He had fought, he had raged, and his reward was to become architecture. Then he looked at Hestian, the mystic who didn't fight at all, the man who welcomed the whispers, who saw the loss of self as a form of transcendence. Hestian's path was one of passive acceptance, surrender. Let the tide take you. Let the song absorb your voice. And in that crushing silence, between the dripping water and the deep thrum of Amphitrite's heart, the final, horrifying truth clicked into place. Grendel's way, Hestian's way. One was a scream, the other a whisper. One was a violent, thrashing drowning, the other was a peaceful slide beneath the surface. But they both led to the exact same place, the bottom, the end of you. The choice Hestian offered wasn't a choice at all. It was just a different door into the same empty room. The peace he preached was the peace of annihilation. The union was the erasure of everything that made a person a person. His daughter's memory, the guilt that had driven him for years, his own name. It would all just be another drop of water in Hestian's silent, collective ocean. A living tomb. "No," Jorin whispered, the word a puff of steam in the cold, damp air. Hestian tilted his head. "No." "No." Jorin said it again, louder this time, the sound of it solidifying his resolve. He took another step back, away from Hestian, away from the wall. The two paths, violence and passivity, both were traps. Both were the echo's victory. There had to be another way, a third path, not to fight it like a blunt instrument, not to welcome it like a god, but to... what?
An image surfaced in his mind, cutting through the whispers of the drowned. A memory that was purely his own. The weathered, kind face of a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands. A man who taught him how to read the groans of stressed metal, how to wield a plasma torch like a surgical tool. A man who understood the city not as a living organism or an enemy, but as a machine that could be understood, a machine that could be fixed or broken. Ealdrick. "Jorin?" Hestian's voice was laced with concern. He saw the shift, the sudden wild light in Jorin's eyes. "Don't run. You cannot outrun the water. Let it hold you." But Jorin was already turning. The thought of his old mentor was a beacon, a single flickering fluorescent lamp in the crushing abyssal dark. Ealdrick wouldn't talk of songs and currents. He would talk of schematics, of pressure tolerances, of fail-safes. He represented a world of logic, of cause and effect, a world that existed before this biological madness had started to literally eat the foundations. Rejecting both paths meant finding a new one, a different one, a human one. Without another word, Jorin broke into a dead sprint. His heavy work boots slammed against the metal grating, the sound a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the deep, resonant hum of the sump. He plunged into a dark, narrow maintenance corridor, the sickly orange glow of the junction shrinking behind him. He didn't look back. He ran from the glowing wall that was once a man, and he ran from the sorrowful prophet who offered peace at the cost of his soul. He ran toward the slimmest, most rust-rotted hope he had left, an old man and a cramped hab unit who might still know how a machine is supposed to work.